Hi, welcome to Digging for Truth. I'm your co-host, Henry Smith. In part one of this two-part episode, we were discussing the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls with Dr. Craig Evans of Houston Baptist University. Dr. Evans has personal experience studying the Dead Sea Scrolls, and he's joining us again today to help us better understand them. So Dr. Evans, welcome back to Digging for Truth for part two of this important episode. Thank you for being here again.
Hi, you're very welcome.
All right. Well, it's as we said in the last episode, it's great to see you, and we're most grateful to have you as our guest. Now, at the end of our last episode, or part one, we were talking about sort of understanding the scrolls and their relationship to the New Testament background. And I thought it would be productive for us to pick up on that. We were talking about Messianic ideas from that time and how different this group of people were in their thought. But let's talk a little bit more about how the Dead Sea Scrolls sort of give us an understanding of the background of the New Testament. There's some really awesome connections beyond the Messianic stuff.
Oh yeah, there are a couple of scrolls that just are stunners in the way they connect with Jesus. We all know every Christmas we recall the words of Annunciation. The angel speaks to Mary and assures her that she's going to have a son. He will be great. He will be called Son of the Most High. He will be called Son of God. He will rule on the throne forever. And then of all things, a fragmentary scroll. In fact, it's just one piece of leather from Cave 4, 2 columns of Aramaic. And guess what it says? It's a futuristic text that talks about someday this from a Jewish line of kings, someone will come who will be great. He will be called Son of the Most High. He will be called Son of God, and he will rule forever. And so you got those 4 very close, 3 of the 4 parallels identical, and 4Q246. That was just a stunner. And that told us that, in Aramaic in the 1st century BC, probably 40 years before Jesus is born, somebody is writing a scroll saying, this is what we're hoping for, that God will raise up somebody who will be Son of God. And there it is. It's at Qumran. There's another scroll. It's also from Cave 4, number 521. And it says that when the Messiah comes, heaven and earth will obey him. He will open up the eyes of the blind. He will heal people who are sick. He'll even raise the dead, and he will proclaim good news to the oppressed and the poor. And of course, you hear that, you think, that's exactly what Jesus told the messengers of John the Baptist. And that's just stunning. And so we realize, wow, Jesus is doing things that people hoped for. In the last program, we talked about Messianic expectation that was violent. Jesus instead taught turn the other cheek. But here we have examples of where Jesus does things that in fact were expected and hoped for in the scrolls. There are other examples. Paul talks about works of the law. So does Qumran. You got to do works of the law, or you won't make it into heaven. And Paul is saying, no, if you do the works of the law, they will not save you. So that's another example of where Qumran sheds important light on the world of the New Testament.
Yeah, that's absolutely remarkable. And it's interesting too from a Christian perspective how we can look at this. Some people, skeptics will just say, oh, the New Testament authors just borrowed those ideas. But if you understand if you believe in an absolute God, there is this theme that people are drawing out of the text. There's things that they miss. The crucified Messiah is the biggest thing that they miss, right? But these other themes and ideas, they're interpreting the text correctly. That's kind of how I view it a little bit. What do you think about that? I mean, is that a reasonable assumption?
I think so, because there's a lot of continuity. When you think about it, I mean, really, all of the Jewish teachers, all the rabbis have it all wrong? Now, how can that be?
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of continuity between Jesus and Old Testament Scripture. And Old Testament Scripture was, for the most part, interpreted, I think, correctly. And so you are going to have important lines of continuity. In fact, I tell my students that when Jesus taught, he would say to the people, "You've heard this said, or you've heard that, and you believe this, but I say something new to you." And so Jesus presupposes Scripture, presupposes a lot of things that are mostly right. And then he throws it into a new perspective. He surprises his hearers with a new insight that they hadn't considered before. And I think that really sums up well the scrolls. Most of it is on target, but the bottom line goes off because they expect the Messiah to come and start killing people.
Yeah.
Instead, the Messiah comes and says, "No, I didn't come here to be served. I came here to serve and give my life as a ransom for many." And that was a big surprise, even for Jesus' disciples.
Yeah, that was the scandalous part that many Jews couldn't get past. And I would imagine if the people at Qumran had heard the gospel, they would have rejected it as well. I mean, some of them would have been around at that time. So let's move a little bit towards the scrolls themselves, just a little bit. These are commentaries we've been talking about. Let's set the stage to talk about the Isaiah scroll a little bit. Got about a minute and a half to do that, and then we'll talk more about it in the next segment. Just tease the audience a little bit about the great Isaiah scroll.
Well, for one thing, it's very old. It's at least 150 BC, maybe 200 BC. The other thing about it is all 66 chapters of Isaiah are there. And we're missing maybe a line or two or a few words at the bottom of the scroll where there was some decay. So the big takeaway is it's very old. It's 1,200 years older than our oldest copy of Isaiah in the Leningrad Codex, which dates to about 1000 AD. So we go back in time 12 centuries, and it's the same text. So that's one of the big takeaways, though there are some other interesting things about the great Isaiah scroll, too.
Yeah, and I've always, when I first learned about the Dead Sea Scrolls, I thought it was remarkable of all Old Testament books that God would sovereignly allow to be preserved like this. He would allow the book of Isaiah, which is drawn out of so often in the New Testament by the New Testament authors.
Well, that's absolutely true. I mean, that scroll must have been one of those in a jar. The jars were emptied by the Bedouins. When they found them, they hoped treasure was in the jars, and of course, from my point of view, treasure was in those jars.
Certainly.
But they were thinking not of old leather; they were thinking of coins, money, jewels, or something like that.
Yes.
And so that great Isaiah scroll was in the jars. Several were in jars in Cave 11 as well. And so they were very well protected. Vermin didn't chew on the leather, tear them apart, which is what happened to most of the other scrolls, unfortunately. But Isaiah was well preserved. And so it tells a thrilling story about how Isaiah was understood, how it was copied, interpreted, yes, even paragraphed. And I'll make a point about that coming up.
That sounds great. Folks, we're with Dr. Craig Evans talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we'll be right back.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures. For students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible, please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your co-host Henry Smith, and I'm here today with Dr. Craig Evans of Houston Baptist University, and we're talking about what many people consider to be the greatest discovery in archaeology of all time, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, Dr. Evans, we were talking about the exciting Isaiah scroll, the great Isaiah scroll, which is almost completely preserved, over 2,000 years old, excuse me. Let's pick up on that. You wanted to share with the audience a little bit more about some of the details of the scroll. Go ahead with that, please.
Well, the Isaiah scroll is famous for chapter 53, the suffering servant. And to be precise, it starts in chapter 52, verse 13, and then goes all the way to the end of chapter 53, verse 12. And it talks about a servant who suffers for his people. He's bruised, he's wounded, and so on. He gives his life, he dies, but he will be vindicated. Well, that's an important passage for some of the New Testament writers, for early Christianity, a very important passage for New Christology, New Testament soteriology, the doctrine of salvation. Jesus himself alludes to it. So it's very important. But some people wondered, well, did Isaiah really say that? Maybe it's a Christian interpolation. And I've actually heard skeptics, sometimes Jewish skeptics, that say, oh, come on. Isaiah 53 was written by Christians later. The real Isaiah in the time of Jesus and earlier didn't have that. Well, we find the great Isaiah scroll. It predates Jesus by at least a century and a half. In Jesus' ministry, the scroll was probably 200 years old, and Isaiah 53 is there. But here's where it gets really interesting. In the New Testament, in 2 or 3 places, in Paul's letters, in the book of Acts when Paul is speaking, also in the book of Acts when Peter is speaking, we have a connection between Isaiah 52:7, and that's that wonderful passage about the messenger whose feet are beautiful when you see him on the hills proclaiming good news. God reigns. And if you go down, that's 52:7. You just go down 2 more paragraphs, and you're in the suffering servant song.
Right.
The servant of the Lord. And so the New Testament connects those. Well, is this a Christian innovation? Is this a spurious interpretation or what? Well, it turns out the great Isaiah scroll understood it that way too. We can tell that because of the paragraphing. There's a major paragraph marker at 52:7 that then connects what follows, including the suffering servant song. So evidently, the Jewish interpreters who copied out the great Isaiah scroll, like I said, 200 years before Jesus' ministry, way before the New Testament was written, they believed there was a link between the gospel, the good news, and the suffering servant who would bring the gospel about. And of course, in the suffering and death of Jesus, that's exactly what happens. In the suffering of the servant of the Lord, that's exactly what happens.
Yeah, that's remarkable. So a detail in the way the text was copied. And as we emphasized before, the people at Qumran ultimately got things wrong, but they got a lot of things, maybe at the micro level, you might say, right. And that is another piece of evidence for that, and another vindication of the way that the New Testament authors handled the Old Testament text. That's remarkable. Now, I want to segue a little bit beyond the Isaiah scroll. You mentioned in our previous segment a couple terms that I want to clarify for the audience that are really important. The Leningrad Codex, okay, you mentioned that. And then there's another term, the Masoretic text. So for those who are in the church who are unfamiliar with these terms, let's talk about that and how that relates to the text from the Dead Sea.
Well, a lot of people don't know this, but the Hebrew language, when it's written out, only writes out consonants, not vowels. And so when you have a consonantal text, I just imagine English trying to do that. It'd be really strange if all you had were the consonants. As you'd recognize some of the words, but a lot of words you'd wonder, I don't know what that is. Well, the Masoretes were these Hebrew scribes who in the time of the church began to put in dots and dashes and little signs that made it clear how the vowels would be sounded out. And this is much later. Well, the question was always, well, do the scrolls at Qumran really reflect the text as it was preserved later? This is an important question.
Yes.
Because if you pick up your English Bible and turn to what we call the Old Testament, that's an English translation of Codex Leningrad for the most part, that the Masorete scholars preserved and vocalized with the vowel sounds. Well, did they get it right? Did they bungle it? Can you trust our English Bibles that are based on it? Well, thanks to the Dead Sea Scrolls, it turns out we can, because that is the same Hebrew back in the time of Jesus and even earlier. So that's one of the big takeaways for the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that is this Leningrad Codex and other Hebrew Bibles that date to about 1000 AD. They got it right. They really do preserve the text very faithfully. And the Great Isaiah Scroll is a showcase example of that.
Yeah, it's a complicated question, the copying of the text over history. There's two things. Is the church has always asked, can we trust that that process has been preserved? Not infallibly, but in principle, God has providentially preserved it, and the scrolls show that. And secondly, has the text been significantly altered? Did the Leningrad Codex reflect what it said 1,000 years before? And the answer is a resounding yes.
And let me elaborate on that, Henry, because there are a lot of people that are interested in this question. You have skeptics that say, "Oh, changes have been made," and the people who believe in the Bible aren't sure. They wonder. Every manuscript in antiquity, before the Gutenberg press, they were written out by hand. That's what the word manuscript means. It means something written out by one's hand, manus, and always there are mistakes, and then of course there's proofreading, and then there are corrections are made, and so most manuscripts are copied very well. I have studied manuscripts that are not scripture, manuscripts from antiquity, and they are not carefully copied in many cases. You have wild changes. So if you want to know, you want to contrast scripture with other writings, heretical writings, for example, books that are outside of the Bible.
Yes.
You see massive changes. Whereas the biblical books, you don't see that. It's always the same. We don't have a copy of Isaiah that's missing 3 chapters.
Right.
In the New Testament, same thing. We don't have a copy of Matthew that only has 25 chapters instead of 28.
Yes.
We don't have a copy of Philippians that has only 2 chapters instead of 4. We're not missing verses. We're not missing whole chapters. We do have a few textual questions here and there, but they're tiny in number. Tiny in percentage.
Yes.
And people need to know that. The scriptures have been very faithfully copied. So when you sit down and open up the Bible and you start reading anywhere, I don't care, Old Testament, New Testament, anywhere, what you're reading actually is what was written a long time ago, and you can be confident of that.
Yes, well, we certainly believe the evidence shows that. We have promises in Scripture that God will superintend over His Word, and the Dead Sea Scrolls affirm that. Folks, don't go away. We'll be right back.
Bible in Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible in Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Hi folks, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your co-host Henry Smith, and I'm here with Dr. Craig Evans of Houston Baptist University. We've been spending the previous episode and this one talking about the importance of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Dr. Evans, in our last segment, we were talking about the significance of the scrolls, particularly the Isaiah scroll, the Great Isaiah scroll, in our understanding of the transmission and preservation of the biblical text. And I think you and I agree that for the church, for people who aren't scholars, who aren't into the minutiae of these things, who don't know Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic, of how important this is for them to have confidence that when they open their Bible and they read a translation, it's coming from a reliable text. Let's build on that a little bit more, because I think what we want to inculcate, we've always wanted to do on this program, is inculcate confidence in God's people, that God has spoken and what we read is in fact what He intended to tell us.
Well, that is very important, Henry. And of course, in recent years, there's been some noise in the popular media about, there's been changes made in the Bible. Sometimes it's this silly conspiracy stuff. the text of Scripture has been altered for some political reason or theological reason. Well, that's a lot of nonsense. The scribes in antiquity were professional people. They were paid to copy accurately and not to make changes. And besides, a lot of scribes weren't theologians. They weren't biblical exegetes. They weren't interpreters. They didn't know what kind of changes to make, even if they had the idea to make a change. That's one of the really silly things about this idea that Christian writings were altered to reflect some orthodox, future orthodox view about Jesus. How in the world would a scribe in the 2nd century know what the Nicene Creed was going to be in the 4th century? I mean, it's really quite silly. And a lot of these professional copyists, they weren't Christians at all. And now if we go back to the Old Testament, it's the same thing. No scribe is going to take the liberty to leave a chapter out, or to insert a verse, or to change something to introduce a new idea.
Right.
That would be unthinkable. And so the only mistakes that are made in copying Scripture are accidental mistakes, usually involving the I, where somebody leaves out a phrase accidentally because he goes from a word that looks the same to the next word as he's looking back and forth, looking at the copy that he's writing, looking at the exemplar that he's looking at. So mistakes like that can be made. But then, of course, there's a corrector who reads it.
Yes.
And, of course,
yes.
And we have the manuscripts, and you see the corrections where some guy goofs and leaves out a word, somebody else writes it in the margin and puts little dots that go back to the place where it's supposed to be. I've looked at these manuscripts. I've been in the Vatican. I've looked at Codex Vaticanus. I've looked at P75. I've looked at a number of manuscripts. I've held them in my hands. You can see how carefully it's done, and when they do make a mistake, it's been corrected. So this idea of mistakes and so on is quite silly, and people need to know that these copies have been made very, very faithfully. And scholars know this. And so when we sit down and look at the Hebrew text or the Greek New Testament, we know we're looking at the text, and we interpret it and we theologize accordingly.
Yeah. I think that's a good word of admonition for the church. And in the cases of, you think back, if you're a scribe, or I'm thinking about it like altering the biblical text. Well, even if someone had the gall to do that, we have so many other manuscripts that would show, if they somehow got away with it, it would show that it was done. So you would see that as an inferior text. And then you have the situation of accidental errors. Sometimes, for example, in the Masoretic text, 1 Samuel, there's some sections of 1 Samuel in the Masoretic that what we call corrupted, means there's been accidental mistakes made. It's interesting, at Qumran, they found scrolls of Samuel that help us to understand the text better, that some of it that was in the Greek agrees with the text at Qumran, and the problem is sort of resolved that way. It's really fascinating. God has preserved it, even when someone makes an accidental mistake.
That's absolutely correct. I don't know how much time we have, but there's an issue, Mark chapter 2, verse 26, Abiathar the high priest is mentioned there.
Yes.
And you turn to the passage, 1 Samuel 21, and it's his father Ahimelech is mentioned there. But if you actually look at the oldest scrolls, nobody is named there. And so in the original story, it's just simply the high priest. And so Mark isn't a mistake. Mark's an early textual witness to the uncertainty that scribes had at the time. Who was the high priest who gave the showbread to the very hungry David and his men? And what this shows is that we can't resolve every single detail in ancient scripture, but scribes were careful.
Yes.
And so we have multiple witnesses, as you just said, and that helps us identify the very few places where there is some uncertainty.
Yeah, I think that's great. It's a great example of that. So, Dr. Evans, we've got about a minute to wrap up. I know the Dead Sea Scrolls, the greatest discovery of all time, and I'm going to give you a minute to wrap it up, but that's your task, so go ahead.
Well, the greatest discovery of all time, I agree with that assessment. I mean, my goodness, we have found a library that dates mostly to the 1st century BC, almost 1,000 texts, many parallels between Jesus and his teaching, contrasts too that really help us understand his distinctiveness. So it is the most important discovery of all times for two reasons. One, we've got 38 of the 39 Old Testament biblical books witnessed. astoundingly totally in the case of Isaiah, and that's very important. The second thing is it sheds light on the thinking of Pharisees, on the thinking of other people in Jesus' time, and it contextualizes. It helps us understand the backdrop better of Jesus' teaching in the New Testament writers. So on the one hand, it builds our confidence in the preservation of Hebrew Scripture, the Old Testament. On the other hand, it helps us understand better Jesus and the authors of the New Testament. So there's got to be providence at work here. What an amazing discovery.
I agree. And Dr. Evans, thank you for that summary. Thank you for taking the time to join us for these important episodes on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And friends, you're watching the show today. We want to inculcate and tell you with confidence that you can trust the Scriptures that God has preserved through thousands of years. Thank you for joining us today.